Good afternoon, everybody. This hearing session is now open. Forms part of the examination of the Merton local plan. My name is RJ Aston, and along with my colleague G.J. Fort, we are the inspectors appointed by the Secretary of State to conduct the examination and to report to the Council in due course. The format of the hearings are structured and focused discussion that we shall lead, and there are some preliminary matters and a bit of housekeeping that I need to get through. Apologies if you've heard some of this already today. But introductions first, please, from the Council.
Tara Butler, Merton Council.
Thank you, Ms Butler. And others from the round table, please.
Tony Michael, Wimbledon Society.
Matthew Spry from Lichfields, representing St William.
Samruti Patel from Savills, representing Clarion Housing.
Thank you. And on Zoom?
Dominic Hill from London Borough of Merton. I'm the Climate Change Officer. Thank you.
Thank you. So the Programme Officer for the examination is Carmel Edwards, who should be the main point of contact prior to and after the hearing sessions and should be copied into all correspondence. Now would be a good time to switch off your mobile phones, or at least turn them to silent, please. And please could the Council indicate the procedures in the event of a fire and whether any tests are due, and advise participants on the location of facilities, please, Ms Butler.
There are no fire drills scheduled during the hearing hours today. If the fire alarm sounds, either intermittently or continuously, please leave the building immediately by the nearest available fire exit without stopping to collect belongings. Staff will direct you to the exits and fire assembly point outside the building. If you are unable to use the stairs, a member of staff will assist you. Fully accessible toilets are available at ground level at the main entrance to the Civic Centre, just left of the stairs. There's a lift just outside the door that takes you down to the toilet. Just beside the entrance to the lift, there is a drinking water dispenser. Please ensure that you sign the Council's attendance sheet at the table at the entrance to the hall if you haven't already. And finally, there's an induction loop system for people with hearing difficulties.
Thank you. The hearings are being filmed and live streamed to YouTube. Is everyone present comfortable with this? Thank you. Does anyone else intend to film or record the event? The matters to be discussed today will be focused questions based upon and taking forward the MIQs and the associated written statements received. Inspector Fort and I are tasked with considering the soundness of the plan in accordance with the criteria of the National Planning Policy Framework and also whether it is legally compliant. The hearings are intended to assist us in that regard. In submitting the plan, the Council considers it is sound, and this is the starting point for the examination. So, if you're challenging the soundness of the plan, then you will have to explain why and what changes might be necessary that would make it sound. And we have read and will consider the hearing statements that have been prepared and also the original representations that were made, and there's no need for these to be repeated. Instead, our aim is that the discussion moves on from those documents and deals with specific questions that we have or areas where further clarification or explanation are required. And at times we may ask for a more general contribution or a summary of your position. And when contributing to discussions, it'd be helpful to us if contributors would stick to the matter in hand and refrain from commenting on any unrelated matters. In order to test the plan for soundness and legal compliance, Inspector Fort and I will need to ask questions. You will have seen that we have already been doing this in preliminary questions and correspondence with the Council in the published MIQ document, and both the Council and other participants have responded to these. The questions will continue today based on those responses, but anything that is asked should not be taken as demonstrating a particular predisposition on our part. We will normally start a particular topic by asking the Council for responses to questions we have before indicating others to comment. For those of you in the room, if you wish to comment, then please indicate this by turning your nameplate on its side, or if you are joining us via Zoom, by using the hands up tool. We may also invite contributions from you on specific points where we think this may assist the examination. And in speaking during the hearing, we would request that you are concise and specific. In particular, if you wish to highlight certain parts of your statements or other documents that form part of the examination, then it's really helpful to us if you can provide the reference. And those present in the room should use the microphones when speaking, And please ensure that they're positioned close to you so that both those in the room and those following virtually can hear what you are saying. Those joining us on Zoom will have to make sure that they are unmuted when speaking to us, but muted at all other times, please. And a gentle reminder not to use the chat or emoji functions that are included in that program. And if you are experiencing any technical difficulties, then please contact the program officer. Okay, so moving on. It's open to the council to propose further changes to the plan, and we would ask that they keep a record of possible changes that arise during these hearing discussions. Any changes that would constitute main modifications would be subject to further consultation. However, no further representations or evidence will be accepted after the hearing sessions are finished unless we specifically request otherwise. Moreover, we're not expecting any further written submissions during the course of the hearing sessions, but we may request further material should discussions indicate that would be useful to us. Now, are there any questions at this stage about the procedural aspect of this hearing? Okay, and then we will now move on to matter 3. Now, in this session, we'll be discussing the plan's approach to climate change. And by way of introduction to this topic, we'd like to invite the council to outline, in broad terms, how the plan has included policies designed to secure that the development and use of land contributes to the mitigation of and adaptation, to climate change, and to what extent the plan is sound and in general conformity with the London plan in these terms. And perhaps, Ms. Butler, if you suggest any main modifications or you refer to them, it'd be useful if you could identify those in your response as you have been doing and explain how they intend to deal with any soundness or legal compliance concerns, and the same for those involved in the round table. Ms. Butler.
I'd like to pass over to my colleague Dominic Hill on Zoom for this introduction.
Thank you, Tara and Inspector. Can everybody hear me okay? I'm going to take that as a yes. So in answer to the question, yes, we believe that Merton's draft climate change policies ensure that development will contribute to the mitigation and adaptation of climate change, and that these are justified, effective, and in general conformity with the London Plan and national policies. Merton's Climate Strategy and Action Plan, referenced to D1, which was adopted in November 2020, forms an important part of the local evidence base for Merton's ambitious and justified climate change policies. This document sets out the pace and scale of change required to achieve Merton's commitment of becoming a net zero carbon council by 2030 and a net zero carbon borough by 2050, in line with our legally binding national carbon reduction commitments. Decarbonising Merton's existing building stock is by far the biggest challenge in achieving our 2050 target. As set out in the local plan, all buildings in Merton will need to operate at net zero carbon by 2050 in order to achieve this commitment. Extensive retrofit will therefore be required to decarbonise existing buildings in Merton. Merton's draft climate change policies therefore aim to ensure that any new development is compatible with operating at net zero carbon by 2050, so as not to add to our already significant retrofit burden. The policies are supported by a wealth of evidence submitted to the examination library. This includes a study commissioned by several London boroughs to investigate the role of carbon pricing in achieving greater carbon savings on site, reference to D12, the findings of which informed Merton's policies and were tested locally in Merton's housing viability study conducted by BNP Paribas, reference 11D7. As set out in our hearing statement on matter 3, our policies are ambitious, but they're also viable and flexible. The policies set ambitious targets for development, but do not tie developers to a particular technology to allow for flexibility as new technologies come forward over the lifetime of the local plan. As set out in reference to D47, Merton's local plan housing viability study tested a range of technical solutions which meet the requirements of Merton's draft policies. Developers can therefore meet the targets with the best solution for the specific site in question. We are conscious that there's a very long way to go in achieving our national and local carbon reduction commitments, but we believe that these policies are a step in the right direction to ensure that new development in Merton doesn't add to the local retrofit burden. That's all from me in terms of an opening statement.
Thank you. How would you prefer to be addressed? Can you hear me?
Yes, Miss Hill would be good.
Mrs.
Ms.
Ms. Thank
Thank you.
Okay. So just in terms of legal compliance and general conformity. We're looking at kind of questions 2, 7 and 11 here really. Looking in more detail, it's quick for the council, now at the MIQ's document and the questions posed there in terms of general conformity and consistency with national policy, which you've touched on in your general response. And obviously we'll move on to discuss that further. But there appears to be a number of instances where the local plan would go beyond either national or London plan policies in terms of climate change matters. And what I'd like to understand is what is special or different about the Merton context that justifies such an approach? Or have there been any material changes in circumstances since the publication of the relevant national planning policies and guidance and the London plan, which justify the plan's higher and more extensive requirements on these things? And I think, Mr. Spry, this goes to the locally specific evidence point that you've made. So I'll ask Ms. Butler if you could respond, and then I'll ask for your view following that, Mr. Spry. Okay, thank you.
I'd like to give Ms Hill.
Apologies, Ms. Williams.
Sorry.
Ms. Hill, of course.
Thank you very much. Yes, so in terms of the current circumstance, there's, I think, extensive justification in the supporting text to policies CC 2.1, setting out the policy gap between where current national and regional policy is and where we need to be to achieve our carbon reduction targets, supported by a range of evidence base from the Committee for Climate Change, the London Energy Transformation Initiative, our own climate strategy and action plan, which sets our own carbon reduction commitments, as well as this piece of evidence that was
Ms.
commissioned
Hill,
by...
sorry, apologies for interrupting you in your
Yes.
flow. May I ask that you just slow down a touch, please?
Of course,
Just
sorry.
because we are making notes. Thank you.
Of course, apologies. So yes, so there's extensive evidence, a range of national, regional and local evidence which supports the need for more stringent policies. This includes reference to D1, which is our climate strategy and action plan, but also reference to D9, which is the London Energy Transformation Initiative's climate emergency design guide, which sets the kind of pace and scale of change that's needed to our policies to deliver our national and local carbon reduction commitments, but also reference to D11, which is the Committee for Climate Change's report on making the UK housing fit for the future, and reference to D12, which was a piece of evidence commissioned by several London boroughs, looking at the cost of carbon and how that can help achieve higher carbon savings on site. In terms of that being specific to Merton, the last reference that I referred to there, reference to D12, as I've said, was commissioned by several London boroughs, and we believe that it tested typologies which are representative of outer London boroughs and the typologies that we see in Merton. And those were tested locally as part of our local housing viability study.
Just probing that a little further, Ms. Hill. In terms of that evidence, how much of that post-dated the publication of the London plan?
So it's a mix. I think most of it came before the publication of the London plan. I think actually all of it was probably before. Yes, I would like to add that the cost of carbon study, so reference 2D12, is going to need to be updated once the new building regulations have been adopted, and I think that's something that's covered in some of the more detailed questions later. So happy to pick that up then. But also worth noting that the GLA is currently in the process of reviewing their guidance in the context of changes to updates to building regulations as well.
Thank you, Ms. Hill. Mr. Spry, you have concerns with the evidence base for this approach. Would you like to outline this a little further, please?
Thank you, Seth. Yes, I think the point we made principally was, I think, the one just made by Mr. Fort there, in terms of a lot of the evidence base predates the London plan, and therefore that evidence base was either available to those preparing the London plan, or it was open for the council to have put that evidence before those preparing the London plan. And there's an important point, I think, of consistency here, in that the London plan sets an overall spatial strategy for London, including housing targets, including assumptions around density and the distribution of development, based on a evidence base that allows it to look at the characteristics of all London boroughs, and then to arrive at an overall spatial strategy and set of policies for them. And as soon as individual boroughs start to divert away from that consistent evidence base, it starts to unravel the internal consistency of the policies within the London plan. So that's a sort of a macro point. I think when it then comes to the evidence base, our points really flow to some of the documents aren't really evidence as such. They're statements of sort of local objectives and aspirations. They also don't necessarily relate specifically to Merton. They relate to groups of boroughs in terms of identifying what it is that's special about Merton and why it needs a different approach. And then the final point is that when it comes to the viability appraisal, whilst it may well be that a number of the climate change objectives that the local plan has will be perfectly achievable on a number of sites, there will be other sites, particularly where there are significant abnormal costs. And I've referred by way of example to the gasworks site that my client is building out, where the viability study hasn't tested development sites with those characteristics, and therefore hasn't demonstrated that a site of that type or with those characteristics could be brought forward with those climate change policy requirements within it.
Before I come back, Ms. Willett, was anyone else around the round table who wanted to make any comments? I think we can deal with this all at once. Okay. Was it Mrs.
Miss Patel.
Mr.
Thank you. I think I'd agree with the points just made by the gentleman regarding the evidence base. The evidence base predates the London plan. It relates to other boroughs and doesn't. I think if you look at it in the context of the GLA's guidance on carbon offset funds, which specifically talks about LPAs setting their own tariffs. That explains that it should be based on the cost of offsetting carbon emissions across the LPA. So there isn't any borough-specific evidence. I think the other point I'd like to make is the key piece of evidence was produced in 2020, and some of the discussion within that document talks about the fact that the London plan, as previously adopted, didn't achieve higher carbon offset measures because of the minimum 35% target. But actually the new London plan does require developments to be net zero carbon, and the carbon offsetting provision is last resort. So although it sets a minimum target, it does require developers to push as far as possible from a technical and viability perspective. So I think those are a couple of points I'd make. In terms of, from my client's perspective, they're working on some strategic regeneration projects across the borough. And again, from a viability evidencing perspective, the typologies and the scenarios that have been tested, if you look at the tables within the viability study, and I can come to this either now or at a later point, but actually most of the scenarios show that there would be a reduction in affordable housing below the 35% sort of baseline threshold that's being set in the local plan. And with the change in tariff as well that's been proposed between the when the viability study was done and then the updated viability note that was produced, if you apply the fact that there's going to be an uplift in costs, actually none of the scenarios or typologies would achieve or maintain the 35%. So there is a sort of cost burden associated with some of the policies that are being put forward. And I think in the context of the NPPF and PPG, which advises that obligations shouldn't or policies shouldn't place a burden on development from coming forward, there's a inconsistency there and a conflict that needs to be considered.
Mr. Michael.
I think there's an interesting question here, isn't it? Which is, how sensible is it to build to a lower standard, which actually then adds to the problem? That is one way of doing it, of course. Another way of doing it is not to build to those lower standards, but to wait until time makes it possible to build to the right standard.
Thank you, Mr. Michael. Ms. Butler, sorry.
I think that was Miss Hill who got cut off, but I think that was inviting me in. Lots of different points to pick up there. If I can possibly start with the putting this into the context of London and why Merton should be going beyond the London plan. On that note, I would probably add that this is the general direction of travel that lots of boroughs in London are moving in. Obviously, the fact that reference 2D12 was commissioned by several London boroughs shows the appetite for moving in that direction, and there is support from the GLA in that direction of travel. And it is harder to perhaps be more ambition across all of London, where there might be more possibility to do more at a local level. In terms of the viability study, one of the points that Clarion raised was around the cost of carbon not being included in the viability testing. So I just wanted to pick up on that point and to say that the cost of carbon is taken into account in the percentage cost uplift for the different climate change scenarios, as shown in Appendix 1 of the viability note. So that's reference 2D47. So you can see in the table there that it shows that that percentage cost uplift includes the construction cost and the cost of carbon offsetting. So hopefully that addresses that point. The question in terms of viability for specific sites, on that one, there's an allowance in paragraph 2.2.21, which includes a provision that if a developer cannot meet the requirements for viability reasons, that this will need to be considered on a case-by-case basis on the submission of a viability assessment. I think particularly in cases like the Mitcham Gasworks site, which is quite unique, we believe that there shouldn't be the expectation that a local plan should test for these quite unique scenarios, and that actually that should sit with the applicant. Also just wanted to note, I think this is something that's flagged in both St William's and potentially in Clarion's responses as well, that both organisations have their own carbon reduction commitments, which in some cases are more ambitious than ours as a borough, which is great to see and very, very welcome. And so hopefully these policies will actually help St William and Clarion achieve their own carbon reduction commitments, which I think are net zero carbon development by 2030 for St William and new homes being net zero carbon compatible for Clarion by 2025, which aligns very closely with what it is that we're proposing through our policies. I'm not sure if I've picked up on all the points that were raised there because there were a few. I don't know if my colleague Tara Butler has anything else to add.
Thank you. Just to pick up on a couple of points about the London plan. The London plan was published finally on the 1st of March 2021, was it was submitted to the Secretary of State in 2018. The examination process lasted from January to May 2019. So there was a considerable amount of time between the drafting of the plan in 2017 and 2018 and its final adoption. 2D12, the Net Zero Cost of Carbon study, was published in May 2020. So that was too late to be a part of the contributions towards the London plan. It was significant. It was 2 years after it was submitted to the Secretary of State and also after the examination had taken place. So it's not correct to say that that could have been used as London plan evidence. It's also the case that the Council has a statement of general conformity with the GLA which doesn't raise the climate change policies as an issue of general conformity. Boroughs are required to be in general, not specific conformity with the London plan. And that means where evidence provides, such as the more recent publication of nationally legally binding and carbon reduction commitments and Merton's own climate change strategy and action plan in 2020, that we're allowed to take these into account as evidence. Finally, no, that's it, finally.
Thank you, Ms. Butler. Did anybody want to come back on any of those points? Mr. Michael?
I think at some stage, I would like to make the point that the plan seems to concern itself with new development, that's to say, where planning permission or whatever is required. But we're pretty sure that between 5 and 10% of the building stock that we will have in 2050 will have been built between now and then. And we're pretty sure that 90 or a little bit more % of the building stock that now exists will be in existence in 2050. So change, new development and so forth has its place, of course, but it's like the tail and the dog. Which is more important? Well, that's for the dog to say perhaps, but the tail I think is the 5 or 10%. The dog is the retrofit of what we've currently got in the way of building stock. And that, I want to be able to say, is where I think this plan is not adequate.
Thank you, Mr. Michael.
I suppose it's a response by way of a question in terms of, I think some of the points that were made are ones that perhaps we respond to under the other individual questions. So it may be we pick up some of those there.
Yeah, there will be quite a bit of that.
Yeah, because sorry, I was just going to say, I think one of the overarching points I think is really around almost the polarity of the flexibility within the plan, in the sense that the London plan is quite clear that when there is a viability question for sites, then when it comes to planning obligations, the weight should be given to affordable housing and then public transport and then health and education on large sites, and then workspace and culture and leisure facilities. That's in policy DF1 of the London plan. And I think the concern is that whereas the viability study does identify the need for flexibility on some sites, it's not clear how that flexibility should be exercised on those sites. Should climate change measures that are quite rigorously expressed in the plan take priority, or should affordable housing take priority? And it's that general lack of clarity when you have a scheme that comes forward that has viability questions about meeting all of the policy requirements and obligations. The plan ought to be providing a clear and unambiguous matrix or framework for how those choices are made. And at the moment, it doesn't do that. I don't know which question I've actually responded to, but hopefully that's just sort of helpful, I suppose, as the overarching point or overall concern.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Spratt. I suppose just in terms of that, given that that is in the London plan, does it have to be in the local plan as well, given what the framework says about avoiding duplication?
I think it does, because policy DF1 is referring to planning obligations and the choices made on planning obligations, whereas what we might be talking about here is the compliance of a proposal against climate change building specification, if you like, which isn't expressly captured within a planning obligation.
Okay, so it's more a point of, in principle, compliance with the development plan.
Yes, and so you have a viability study that says, look, don't worry, if there's a particular site that has extra costs, then we can be flexible in deciding what choices are made. But it's not clear. Well, at the moment, the plan is expressed saying, well, the prime requirement is meeting climate change requirements, with, we would suggest, not sufficient clarity as to what flexibility there is for that versus flexing the affordable housing requirements. And it's that trade-off. If you're faced as an applicant with the policies as expressed, how would you approach that trade-off? What is it the council would find acceptable in terms of, for example, meeting the full affordable housing expectations of the plan versus meeting the climate change specifications that are set out in the different policies? And I read the suite of policies together, and I don't have the clarity there to answer that question.
Thank you, Mr. Spry. Ms. Patel?
Thank you. Just one point to add. The GLA, in their response to the Regulation 19, I think the stage 3 consultation, did identify a conformity issue. I don't think it was the main issue. So the way it was worded was, while the Mayor commends Merton's positive response to the climate emergency, policy DF1D of the London Plan 2021 should be applied, which prioritises affordable housing and necessary transport improvements to those situations where viability is called into question. But I'm just questioning really there whether, a point of conformity was raised by the Mayor, and how has that translated it through the modifications, and is there enough in the supporting text to identify viability considerations being taken into account, or should it actually go into policy? And I think the point that we've made in our hearing statement is it should be worded into the policy, so that it's clear that viability would be taken into account.
Okay, so thanks for that, Ms. Patel. So moving on, I'm going to invite you in a minute, Ms. Butler, but just reflecting on those points. Firstly, Mr. Michael's point. So how does the plan react to that point? A lot of at the end of the plan period, a lot of the housing stock of the borough is going to be housing that's in existence now, and indeed building stock more generally. So in those terms, what does the plan do to promote reuse and sustainable reuse of those resources and retrofit? And what can it do? I mean, what is in the control of the planning authority in those terms?
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Michael is right. The retrofit challenge is vast. The borough has 86,000 homes roughly today, and many of those will need to be retrofitted before we get to 2050. And the council is tackling this in a number of ways. It's fair to say that the most significant ways are outside this local plan. So, for example, with Clarion, as Ms. Patel has stated, we have an estates local plan, a separate local plan to guide the regeneration projects Ms. Patel is speaking about. And that looks at redeveloping key estates, part of which will bring them up closer to carbon compliance, as is set out in the works that is ongoing with Clarion. Other matters take place outside the planning system, and it's fair to say that much retrofit doesn't have to necessarily apply for planning permission. So there are other actions the council is taking through its climate strategy and action plan towards retrofit. And as set out in Merton's local plan, there are policies that support retrofit of existing buildings. And particularly on this case, we're trying to make sure we don't have to retrofit buildings that will be built in the next few years, again, prior to 2050.
Mr. Michael, you got something else on that point?
I suppose it runs to what we think the plan is for. Sorry, it's a rather pompous statement by me. At the moment, it seems that the plan is geared to dealing with planning applications and so forth, of course. But if we have this climate change issue, which is very major, facing us, how are all our local government organizations, because they're the only one that actually matter, how are they all going to deal with it? It seems to me that the plan for a borough needs now to not just deal with what somebody wants to change in the way of getting permission and so forth. It should also be proactive. It should have proposals and initiatives and say, this is what we need to do in order to achieve these project targets. This will be quite new for many local authorities, of course, but I feel that to have a plan of this kind that we're conventionally talking about, and then some other kind of a plan somewhere, probably not under the same sort of umbrella, seems very unsatisfactory. If we go back a bit you can see the color of my hair. If you go back a bit and look at some of the earlier plans, you will see, I think, a lot of creative stuff. And over the years, for a variety of reasons, it seems that the planning system has got a bit less strong on that in many cases. And I don't feel that that is the right way of doing it. The only two parts of local government that deal with buildings are the building regulations side and the planning side. More or less, you could say, nobody else in the local council knows anything about buildings. So who is going to take the initiative? Are we going to ask building control to take the initiative? But building control is essentially, oh, so you've got permission, now this is how you must build it in order to be safe and so forth. They're not a really outward-looking group, building control. Planning is, and has always been so. And I feel that the planning office, whatever we want to call it, in local councils has to take the lead and drive retrofitting. It's new, for many of us, it's a new skill, of course. We have to accept that. But if we do not, then I'm looking at some quotes here which really don't make very good reading from, if I may, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, is calling for a dash to a low carbon economy and say that the greenhouse gas emissions must peak by 2025. Okay, well, that's rather blunt. It's got 6 things that it's saying. They're uncomfortable reading. It says that the world is failing to make the required changes. Secondly, there will be catastrophic consequences otherwise. Atmospheric CO2 is now at 400 parts per million and rising, where the safe level is set at 350 and the pre-industrial level was 280. Investment in low carbon action is 6 times lower than it should be, they say. And some governments, this is a very unkind phrase by the UN Secretary General, some governments are lying about being on course to achieve emission targets. Now, when you read that stuff, you wish any council's plan well, of course, but is it going to respond to that really rather hard thing to read? I don't think it does. And I think, therefore, that the plan's main thrust should be to grab this climate change question and to do a lot, that's rather a pompous phrase again, just to do a lot. We're not doing it at the moment. There's another phrase recently that the council's own emission reduction targets for both its own buildings and for the borough as a whole are, the phrase is, unlikely to be met for both 2030 and 2050 dates. That's uncomfortable reading. So if that's the context for the plan, the society feels this plan should really be refocused to deal with climate change, not with growth.
Thank you, Mr. Michael. Ms. Butler.
And just briefly draw the inspector's attention to the urban development objectives in the submitted local plan, particularly strategic objective 1, climate change, tackling climate change, I should say. It has parts A to G, and most of the plan focuses on the future and matters that will consider planning permission. Part G refers to promoting the retrofit of greater improved energy performance to existing buildings and greater connections with renewable and decentralized energy. And it's fair to say that the issue of retrofit is throughout the local plan. For example, recognized in policy D12.5, managing heritage assets, particularly as developments within or near heritage assets often don't have permitted development rights, so will therefore require planning permission. And other policies like F15.9, sustainable drainage, which also refers to the opportunities to retrofit buildings and structures with sustainable drainage measures. So while by necessity the plan focuses on growth, because this is the local plan, and much of our actions on retrofit are dealt with through the climate strategy and action plan, this plan does also support the retrofit of buildings where the local plan is engaged.
Thank you. Mr. Michael.
Without labouring it too much, I think if the council is serious about wanting to deal with retrofit, which is excellent, there are policies, of course, that's fine. It isn't enough to have the policies, it's also necessary to have the programmes, the targets and the allocation of resources all published up front so that we can see whether we are doing the right thing or whether we are not quite achieving it. Without those, it becomes talk.
Thank you.
Okay, Ms. Butler, if I can take you to the framework, so that I'm looking at paragraph 152, which says the planning system should support the transition to a low carbon future in a changing climate, taking full account of flood risk and coastal change. It should help to shape places in ways that contribute to radical reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, minimize vulnerability and improve resilience, encourage the reuse of existing resources, including the conversion of existing buildings, and support renewable and low carbon energy and associated infrastructure. So, I mean, to wrap up on the sort of general opening questions on this point, you know, how successful do you think? And hearing what Mr. Michaels said about, you know, other programs and projects that should be or could or should be assisting with this agenda. To what extent has the plan as a whole, not just the climate change policies we're talking about today, sort of responded to that? What the framework anticipates the planning system should be about in terms of climate change?
Yes, we consider that really goes to the heart of Merton's local plan. Particularly, as we said in the introduction, Merton is largely an already developed borough, built over hundreds of years, really. It is usually the case that development sites are occupied by a building or something, a structure. There are many policies in Merton's local plan that take forward MPPF paragraph 152. That includes policy F15.1, one second. Which looks at, oh, one second, I've got the reference wrong there. On the policy reference on flood risk, it looks obviously at the climate change policies and the design policies D12.1, which also look at delivering well-designed and resilient neighbourhoods. In particular, D12.1 goes into details about being adaptable and resilient to the impact of a changing climate in part B, enabling sustainable and healthy lifestyle choices in part C, which relates to public realm. And in essence, the strategic policies right throughout the plan pick up on the objectives of MPPF paragraph 152.
Thanks. And anything in terms of the spatial strategy more generally, Ms. Butler?
Draw inspectors' attention to chapter 1B, good growth, which again it references the London Plan good growth objectives. It references the Sustainable Development Goals. It also moves on to talk about the infrastructure needed to support growth. And it sets out the spatial strategy, which enables that growth to take place. Then in in chapter 1C, we go back to the urban development objectives, of which the first is tackling climate change. Which leads on to the vision, of which the first one is, first item in the vision is achieving net zero by 2050 in partnership with other organizations.
Thank you. We just want to kind of move on, just a couple of things on London Plan Policy DF1D and viability. Notwithstanding the Mayor's view on general conformity, is this an aspect of the plan which diverges from the policy DF1D of the London Plan? And if so, what is the justification for that, please?
Thank you. As summarised in our response to question, question 2 of matter 3, the MPPF is clear in paragraph 57 what planning obligations should be sought for and the 3 tests of planning obligations necessary to make the development acceptable, directly related, and fairly and reasonably related in scale and kind. The London Plan in policy DF1 gives clarity that weight should be, for specific development sites, the MPPF and the London Plan DF1 are clear that it's for the applicant to demonstrate whether particular circumstances justify the need for a viability assessment at planning application stage, and that the weight to be given to that assessment is the matter for the decision maker. In the case of prioritising affordable housing or public transport improvements or climate change, it is absolutely the case that any planning obligations will have to meet these 3 tests. And that will be for the decision maker to determine, taking account of London Plan Policy DF1, but also the particular circumstances of that site. For example, if there wasn't an affordable house, a public transport obligation that met the MPPF tests, the decision maker might not engage London Plan Policy DF1.
Thank you, Ms. Fuller. Are the provisions for viability testing in relation to climate change matters sufficiently clear?
As set out in our statement, and I'm struggling to find the exact paragraph right now, we believe that referencing this matter in the supporting text does make it clear enough. And I would add to that by saying it's in the event that there is a viability challenge on any site in the next 15 years, it isn't only the climate change or the affordable housing policies that should be considered in isolation in the event of a viability challenge. As recognised in London Plan Policy DF1, there are other matters that might come to play, such as public transport as well. So we do believe it's sufficiently clear that in the event of a viability challenge on a particular site to do with those specific circumstances, that will be considered in the round.
Okay, thank you. Just some views from around the table, please, if there are any, including any proposed solutions.
Sorry, I didn't put my.
No, that's fine, Mr. Smith.
Yeah, I mean, I think that point I think has got to the crux of one of our main concerns, which is, and apologies if I've missed it, but I don't think it's clear in the plan how the climate change policies might or might not be flexed when there's a viability question, and how that should be related to the question of planning obligations in line with DF1. There is the reference in the viability study, which is you picked up in your questions, which suggests that climate change would sit at the top of the hierarchy by referring to reducing other policy requirements, including affordable housing, to compensate for those costs. But it's not clear that that primacy, if it is a policy objective, features in the plan. It's not, as far as I can see, in a policy. It's not, as far as I can see. I'm happy to be corrected in supporting text. And as a result of that, if there is a trade-off to be made, there isn't a clear policy within the plan that helps an applicant understand how a decision maker would react to a set of proposals were they brought forward. And in that context, the approach to the plan is unsound in terms of para 16D in requiring clearly written and unambiguous policies that help so it evidence how a decision maker should react to development proposals. So my suggestion would be, first off, if the plan is to be based on an assumption that climate change policies take priority, there needs to be an evidence base to justify that primacy in terms of the sustainability appraisal. But if those climate change requirements go above those minimum ones in the London plan, I don't think the sustainability appraisal does that at the moment, because that choice hasn't been explicitly tested. But if it has made that choice, there then needs to be a clear policy around the viability assessment that sets out clearly how, in a sense, takes forward and expands upon the principles of DF1, and would then explain how climate change requirements sit within the hierarchy of other policy objectives within the plan. And if the council says, well, actually, we don't have a hierarchy, we don't put climate change above affordable housing, it should be traded off against the others, then I think we would need to be very clear that such a policy was clear to an applicant, because I don't think it would be, because you'd be sat there with a set of policies designing a scheme and not knowing whether you should give more, but where there's a viability question, you wouldn't know whether to bring forward a scheme that's got more focus on affordable housing or more focus on climate change, or indeed more focus on other policy objectives. So I do think we need that policy in the plan, or failing that, we should revert back to where the London plan is, which is you go with the climate change policies in the London plan, and if schemes can go above that, they can do that after they've met the planning obligation requirements in policy DF1. So it's a bit of a ramble, but hopefully that was clear.
No, thank you, Mrs. Roy, very clear. Ask you, Ms. Patel, because I think you have some general views on viability as well.
Yeah.
So perhaps if you could maybe follow on from Mr. Spry, and then if you want to return to your kind of more general point.
Yes, so just following on from the points that were raised, I think the council do include a provision relating to viability in supporting text, whereby they say if a developer contends the policy requirements in relation to viability of a particular proposal, the onus would lie on the developer to demonstrate what can viably be achieved through the submission of a viability assessment. I think, as I mentioned before, I think that would sit better in policy. I think one of the other policies in the local plan relating to affordable housing, for example, sets out its threshold affordable housing levels, and within the policy itself, it specifically talks about sort of that being subject to viability. So I think particularly in the context of policy DF1 of the London plan, which sets that primacy to affordable housing, I think it's important that that provision is reflected within the policy itself. I think on the viability study, as was mentioned, that currently identifies potential for affordable housing to be reduced as a result of some of these climate change policies. I think Ms. Hill confirmed that the carbon offsetting figure is taken into account. If I could draw your attention to the viability study, I haven't got the reference here, but that at paragraph 6.57 says that in many cases, the residual land value reflecting 35% affordable housing will exceed the benchmark land value. And that suggests that through the testing, it has been identified that there are many cases where the typology testing shows the 35% affordable housing being retained, but actually running through the actual results, what's clear, and I've got a mark up here, if that would be helpful, but it's just looking at the tables. But actually, the vast majority of tests that have been carried out show a reduction in the affordable housing. And actually, I think even in the highest value areas, there are only 12 scenarios that maintain 35%, and that's out of 150 scenarios that are tested. It's only housing schemes which are maintaining the 35%. So I think this additional cost burden is I think it's underrepresented in the wording and the way it's commented upon in the viability study. A lot of the schemes in the borough will be flatted developments. I think the AMR talks about the fact that 50% of the homes in the borough are from large or medium sites. So there is a large amount of development that's going to be coming forward in the borough where applying these climate change policies, there will be a cost burden and there will be a challenge regarding viability. So I think that's another reason why viability should be framed within the policy wording itself. Given the results and the sort of number of typologies tested and the fact that most of them show a reduction in affordable housing, I'd also question whether the plan is justified in the sense of have all reasonable alternatives been tested in respect of these sort of additional minimum targets and carbon offsetting requirements that have been outlined.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Patel. I'd see that Ms. Hill has got a hand up. Was it on the previous point or on these particular points that have just been brought up now?
I had a couple of points, both on Mr. Michael's point around retrofit, and I'm happy to pick up on part of that question around viability, if I may. So just on Mr. Michael's point, just to add to what Ms. Butler said around where the local plan refers to retrofitting existing buildings and ensuring climate resilience. I just wanted to add as well that the climate change policies themselves also refer to prior to retrofitting existing buildings in the context of creating new dwellings and new non-residential space in particular. So not focusing on retrofitting existing homes, but creating new homes through conversions and change of use, for example. So just to list a couple of other examples to what Ms. Butler said earlier, for example, policy CC 2.5A relates to prioritising the reuse and retrofit of existing buildings wherever possible before considering the design of new buildings. Policy CC 2.2 refers to all development resulting in the creation of one or more dwellings or 500 metres squared or more non-residential GIA, which includes change of use and conversions. And there are specific targets within the different elements of that policy for change of use and conversion applications as well. And just to add on the wider picture of that question, and I think Ms. Butler's already touched on this, around the fact that we're doing more around retrofit outside of the framework of the local plan, but worth just noting that in our climate delivery plan for this year, 2022, there's a plan there to develop a retrofit strategy for the borough, which may address some of the concerns and questions raised by Mr. Michael. So that was just on that first point. And just quickly touching on the viability side of things, picking up on some of the stuff that Ms. Patel just raised, if I may. I just wanted to flag that as set out in Merton's note on viability testing, so that's reference to D47, Merton's local plan housing viability study tested a range of technical solutions which meet Merton's draft requirements, combining different fabric and heating system specifications in the different housing typologies. So if the best practice solution with the highest cost uplift isn't viable on a given site, other good practice options with a lower cost uplift can still be considered in order to meet our minimum requirements. So I just wanted to flag that as some of the kind of higher end of the cost spectrum that Ms. Patel might be looking at maybe doesn't take into account the the lower cost options. So by testing a range of costs that allow all developments to meet Merton's climate change policies, we believe that we've considered reasonable alternatives to meeting the climate change policies. So that was just a point on that. But I think in terms of the wider kind of viability testing for the plan and whether to incorporate that in a policy, I will ask Ms. Butler to pick that one up, coming back to Mr. Spry's points. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Hill. So, yeah, I suppose coming back to that point, Ms. Butler, in terms of the policies. So we had two general points there. One, is there a primacy of the climate change requirements when we're looking at planning obligations? And if there is that articulated in the plan, and is it justified? And secondly, in terms of that viability point, is it sufficiently clear, and is it effective in terms of to a decision maker in terms of how those viability implications will be considered, and would they be consistent with policy DF1 of the London plan?
Thank you, Inspector. No, despite what Mr. Spry quoted in the viability study, as with all evidence, we gather evidence from different sources, and the plan doesn't contain a policy that says in all circumstances, when there is a trade-off, this will be the result. And that's partly because the London plan already contains direction indicating in the event of issues what should be the order of preference, but also partly because any planning obligations need to pass the necessary tests, and it may be on certain sites that there is an issue, an exceptional cost, for example, that needs to be borne. That means that a contribution towards a local school or something that isn't immediately captured in DF, London Plan Policy DF1, isn't there. So it provides the necessary flexibility. We believe the viability statement is clear and effective, and I would return to the point that it isn't just affordable housing or climate change that are affected when there is a viability challenge. However, I note that that's probably the second time you might have asked that question, so it might be something the council needs to reflect upon.
Yes, I think that is something that should be reflected on in terms of looking at a main modification. I mean, we've heard views, haven't we, that it's not immediately clear to applicants, because we've got two applicants here. So in terms of how that might be considered, and just in terms of the effectiveness of the plan, if you could consider what main modifications might make that clearer. Okay, in terms of the other points, I think we'll reflect on those in terms of viability and that primacy issue you raised, Mr. Spry. I think we'll reflect on that and cover it if necessary in our post hearings letter. But is there anything else at this juncture in terms of the viability or the policy DFD of the London plan, Ms. Patel?
Sorry, I was just going to check. Would it be acceptable for us to submit this analysis? It's effectively the viability study tables which we've taken out and just identified the sort of the point that we're making regarding the impact and the cost burden arising from the policies. Okay.
Why was it not submitted along with your hearing statement, Ms. Patel?
I think it was well, it was produced afterwards in terms of the actual numbers of schemes and typologies that were tested. But I mean, it's not essential. I think that the one, if I can make one further point, if we aren't submitting it, Ms. Hill mentioned sort of the viability note and the typologies that were tested. So as I understand it, there were 5 scenarios that were tested, the best practice being the most expensive, and then sort of the slightly lower specifications, which would still achieve the council's policies, but are less costly. In terms of the flatted scenarios, I think every single scenario becomes more expensive with the council's revised approach to the carbon offset figure, and with the housing typologies, scenario 1 effectively becomes more expensive than scenario 2. And taking that into account, every single tested scenario and typology would end up falling below 35% affordable housing. So it's just one that I think that's an important point to consider when considering whether viability should be sort of brought into the policy wording. I think it's clear from the evidence base that there are going to be viability implications for both flatted and housing schemes across all typologies.
Ms. Butler, have you got any views on whether we should accept that annotated table from the viability evidence that Ms. Patel has offered to us?
Well, I'm conscious that viability has been dealt with the day after tomorrow. So if it is accepted, it will give all participants very little time to consider it. But if you would like to accept it, we can do our best to review Clarion's assumptions on this. I would just point out that in document 2D47 does summarise the range of cost uplifts, and that's associated with, for houses, that's 1.16% to 2%, or sorry, 2.05. And for houses, for flats, it's slightly more. But all the costs still stay within the scenarios that were tested. I am conscious that I'm straying on to matter 4, but also to say that the viability study tested a blended rate of carbon pricing, so that the final simple approach we have in the local plan looks simply at £300 a tonne. So that's where things can't be done on site. Frankly, we're not looking for any carbon offset in any circumstances, but we do appreciate that sometimes, especially with complex buildings or scenarios which are refurbishing a building, that matters can't be addressed on site, and we have to accept carbon offsets. In the viability study, we looked at a blended rate. So my recollection is that below 60% on site, we tested £1,000 a tonne. Between 60 and 80%, we tested £300 a tonne, and above 80%, we tested £100 a tonne. In the plan, as submitted, you will see the rate is kept simple at £300 a tonne. And the submitted statement 2D47 addresses the difference between the blended rate 1,000 to 100 versus the final £300 rate, and points out that the cost uplift was 0.02%. I would also finally point out that the regeneration project that Ms. Patel is referring to is covered by the estate's local plan, which itself went through the full plan process, was tested for viability, went through examination, and was adopted by the council in 2018. So specific costs relating to estate regeneration were considered in one of the council's adopted local plans. Therefore, weren't considered for a second time here.
Mr. Michael.
I think it would be quite helpful to know if an application raises this question of viability. It would be helpful to know whether or not climate change criteria or compliance or whatever would be have primacy, and all of the other elements would, as it were, take their place below it, or whether climate change is a rather grand phrase, whether climate change issues themselves would be reduced. You see my point? There's a question there. Which way does the plan want to go? I mean, I would want to argue, wouldn't I, that the climate change views would have primacy, and that would be the objective, and what then followed would ripple down. But that's only one point of view. But I think if it was possible for the plan to be clearer about that, it would be helpful, rather than to have it, as I think I understand it from my colleagues on the left, a little bit more variable than that.
Thank you, Mr. Michael. I think we've got that point, and I said that's something I think we'll have to go away and think about in a bit more detail before we reflect on it in a post-hearings letter. But yeah, we've heard that point now, and that's something we'll revisit the relevant policies and look at in that respect.
I think we'd like to move on now. I'm just a bit conscious of time. I think we would like to take a break. It's quite warm this afternoon, and we have been going for just over an hour and 15 minutes. But I think we could maybe just turn back to deal with the building regs before then going on to questions 5, 6 on heritage assets, and then some on the policies. So I hope that will be sufficient for the next session. Okay. Mr. Spry, a question for you, please. Is the proposed uplift over and above building regulations requirements consistent with national policy and guidance? And what are the potential implications of recent changes for Part L of the building regulations? I'll invite you first, Mr. Spry, and then if Ms. Patel and Mr. Michael have anything to add before asking for Ms. Butler and Ms. Hill's response. Thank you.
So let's turn up to the point we had. Yeah, so I think the starting point for this is the MPPF at para 154, which point B, which basically says that any local requirements for the sustainability of buildings should reflect the government's policy for national technical standards. So I think the key thing there is the word reflect. And so when you reflect something, you mirror back what those technical standards are. So the starting point for a policy is that you work with the national technical standards, i.e. the building regulations, and there's a clear presumption there for, or rather not for the planning system to try and replicate, duplicate, or deviate. So that's like a radio 4 panel show, isn't it? Sorry, deviate from the standards that the government's setting in regulations. And there's an important reason. So I was waiting for that. There's an important reason for that, which is Merton isn't an island, and developers who are bringing forward residential schemes will be doing so across London. And if you have a myriad sort of patchwork of standards, then it becomes difficult for developers to develop efficient and effective ways of responding to those standards, because you have to have a different mosaic of different standards coming together. So I think that should be the starting point. We've then got, obviously, we're in a moving set of circumstances. So I think the new building regs come into play tomorrow, in fact, I think, on the 15th of June. So there are the concerns I think we've got with the plan is that the plan at the moment says that there'll be a insofar as the current plan sets a stretching target on the current building regulations, that stretching target will be applied to the new building regulations. And obviously the feasibility of that hasn't been tested, and it's also different to the approach of the London plan. So the London plan says when the building regulations are updated, the policy threshold will be reviewed, not that the policy threshold will move, just equivalent stretching change from those new standards. So if you, I think we had it in our matter statement at para 120. So the new Part L building regs will expect around 31% reduction on the 2013 building regulations. And if you took the current wording of the statement that's quoted in the question in the plan, that would allow the council to request a 91% reduction on the current building regulations when they're adopted. By current, I mean current as in today, as opposed to tomorrow. So that stretch hasn't been tested and worked through, and it's not consistent with the approach of the London plan. And I mean, it just generally goes, I think, to the point that there's a reason that sustainable building standards are dealt with in building regulations rather than in the planning system. And that's clearly what the starting presumption is of the government's policy. Thank you.
Is there anything else on the table on those points? Mr. Michael?
Yes, almost as an aside, there was something called the Merton rule. Now, my memory tells me that it was 20 years ago or so that I could see a smile on the dais there.
That's just because it was before my time, Mr. Michael.
Sorry. It's nearly not before mine. What I was trying to get at is there was a borough called Merton, and it decided, for a variety of reasons, I think, mainly because of one particular person, captured the ideas of the council at that time, really saying, come on, we really should have a much better set of standards than is generally the case when it comes to energy. Because at that time, just before, I think, in Beddington, we had one of the very first in the UK sustainable housing developments. We all went and visited it. That was great. And Merton, to his credit, I think, said, all right, we'll adopt these standards. And what were they? Well, essentially, trying to dredge around in my memory, I think it was then called Code 6 or possibly Code 5, applying to residential. And in effect, you had to reach that level before you got your planning permission. I mean, that's putting it rather crudely. And everyone said, my goodness, the sky is going to fall in. No, it didn't actually fall in. And what happened was a number of other boroughs, and not just in London, decided to follow the Merton rule. And it just seemed to make some sort of a sense to everybody, sort of sitting back from the detail of individual applications. Subsequently, government then said, yes, that's a pretty good idea, but now we're going to stop all of that. We're going to think of another way of doing it. And I think that was the end of the Merton rule as it then was. But my point being, is there a case for one borough doing something a little different and trying to pull the other boroughs along? I think the question is always there, isn't it? But I recognize from Mr. Spry's point of view, it really is quite difficult. You have a mosaic. And so between those two extremes, if you like, there is this question. Which way do we want to go? Follow the standard package, or have an opportunity for iconoclastic ideas.
Thank you, Mr. Michael. Ms. Buller?
Thank you, Inspector. Dealing with the issue of building regulations as set out in our response to question 18A of matter 3. I won't repeat it because you advised us not to, but just to say we have got legal advice on this. We are allowed to go beyond building regulations. The ministry, what was then the Ministry for Housing, Community and Local Government didn't intervene to stop any council going beyond, and also to point out that the London Plan itself goes beyond building regulations. The comment about reflecting national technical standards is not just in the MPPF 2021, but it was also in paragraph 150 of the MPPF 2019 and the MPPF 2018. So many local planning authorities around the country, and including the planning authority that is the Mayor of London, have gone beyond building regs where it's justified and where it meets the soundness tests. So in summary, it is possible to do so. On the second point about targets and jumping up targets because of the change in building regulations, I think it's important to draw your attention to paragraph 3.38 of our response to matter 3, question 8B, which proposes a modification to the plan, to paragraph 2.28 of the plan, to clarify that we would be seeking an equivalent target. So in other words, to make it easier for applicants to implement under the new building regs, not seeking to take the new building regs and then apply a massive percentage jump up. So in other words, we're looking at the same targets, but against new building regs. And that's, my colleague Dominique Hill may want to come in as she has been liaising with the GLA on the issue that Mr. Spry raised about their proposed targets.
Would you like to come in, please, Ms. Hill?
Yes, please. Thank you. Yes, so just to add what Ms. Butler was saying there, so the GLA is actually currently in the process of reviewing their energy assessment guidance in light of the changes to building regulations. So as Mr. Spry, I think, mentioned, building regs Part L 2021 is due to be published tomorrow, is my understanding, but the modelling behind the new Part L isn't due to be formally confirmed until the end of July. There have been delays in that at a national level. The GLA has been updating their London Plan guidance in light of those changes, and they plan to publish their guidance this week as well, but that won't come into effect until the end of July once all the Part L changes have been formally adopted. I think it's worth noting there that the GLA is actually sticking with their 35% target improvement against Part L 2021. So they're taking a different approach to us, where, as Ms. Butler was explaining, we would translate our targets, which are currently set against Part L 2013, we would translate them to have an equivalent target against Part L 2021. So it wouldn't result in I think you mentioned a 90% improvement being required. The GLA have actually, they're maintaining their 35% improvement against Part L 2021, which will actually be quite close to the target that we're looking to set in our draft local plan. So I just thought I would mention that because that kind of, I think, answers some of the questions that were raised around this mosaic effect across London, and that actually they will be closer with that change that's happening at a regional level as well. I think it's also worth noting that in working with other boroughs on this, which is exactly what we're doing, and we're actually going to be commissioning a piece of work to review the targets that we've set based on that reference to D12, going to be commissioning a review of that in the context of changes to Part L. And we're doing that with other London boroughs so that we can develop a consistent approach across London. And this is definitely the direction of travel that other boroughs are moving in as well. I think that was all from me on that one. Thank you.
Okay, I've got two follow-up questions on that one. The first one, just to clarify, so GLA are looking at a higher target against the new building regs. So how would that be affected? Is that a partial review of the London plan with an updated policy to that effect?
So sorry, apologies.
Sorry, Ms. Hill, carry on.
I was just going to say, my understanding is that they are updating their energy planning guidance, and they've included a note on their energy planning guidance webpage, which says that they are looking to implement that 35% improvement against Part L 2021. That guidance, I think, is due to be published this week, so we should have more information. I don't know more detail, much more detail beyond that, but we should be able to, and the inspector should be able to see what the detail is. But I just thought it was worth flagging that there is more ambition happening at the London level as well, which is very welcome. And I think that ties into the earlier question of whether we're justified in going beyond building regulations. I think the London plan has been doing that for years, and boroughs have been implementing that for years. And I think our supporting text for policies CC 2.1 and 2.2 highlight the need for that higher level of ambition beyond Part L if we want to achieve our commitments. And London is in a better place to actually achieve higher targets, so we should be driving ambition where we can. Thank you.
Thank you. So that's in effect supplementary planning guidance, is it?
I think it's fair to say that we're not sure at this stage. I've brought up the GLA's webpage, which simply repeats what Ms. Hill has said. And at this stage, how they implement that. My understanding is that there is a footnote in the London plan that they are resting some of this information on, but at this stage, we couldn't be sure. It will have to become apparent before stage 2 hearings in July, because, in October, because the building regs modelling is due to be published by national government in late July. But as to what that looks like, all we know at the moment from constant dialogue with the GLA and the other 32 boroughs is that this is their intention.
Okay, so you said there'll be a modification to bring some clarity on this issue in the local plan. It's tied up with what's going on with the London plan. So I think we know we can sort of flag that there's a modifications needed. We can wait and see what emerges before stage 2 hearings, and then finalise wording on it and intention of it further at that stage. I think that might be a sensible thing to do, Ms. Butler.
Yes, we can do that. I'd just say that our proposed approach is not to raise our target. It's to have the equivalent, just to make it easier for, instead of people going back to the 2013 building regs for applying policy and using 2021 for building. We're looking at the equivalent. But yes, it might be worth looking at this towards October when stage 2 is around and we're clearer how the London plan has, or if the London plan has changed.
I just want to pick up the point you touched on the written ministerial statement. So that was the 2015 one that brought in the technical standards effectively, and it contains national policy on that. So that's explained further in the PPG on climate change. And as you correctly say, local planning authorities can set energy performance standards for new housing or the adaptation of buildings to provide dwellings that are higher than the building regulations, but only up to the equivalent of level 4 of the Code for Sustainable Homes. So that, I mean, that's practice guidance, but that seems to support what the written ministerial statement says in these terms. So what's changed since then that justifies the different approach taken in the local plan?
Sorry, Inspector, could I just ask what you're quoting for when you referred to this Code for Sustainable Homes?
So yeah, it's a planning practice guidance on climate change. So that's paragraph 12, reference ID 6012 2019 0315. So that explicitly refers to the written ministerial statement there.
Apologies if I may jump in.
Please do.
Thank you. So I think this question is answered in our response to question 18A. And this is a question that we got legal advice on back in August 2022 to understand if we were restricted in the targets that we could set. And the legal advice that we received was that the ministerial written statement was not a barrier to setting more ambitious carbon reduction targets, given that the restrictions on the powers of local authorities would only come into effect if the Secretary of State were to bring into force capping provisions in the Deregulation Act, and that hadn't happened yet. In addition to that, in the consultation on the government's future home standards, they also confirmed, the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government confirmed that in the immediate term, we will not amend the Planning and Energy Act 2008, which means that local authorities will retain powers to set local energy efficiency standards for new homes. So hopefully that answers the question. And I think we'll also refer back to the London plan and the fact that the London plan has been setting targets beyond Code for Sustainable Homes level 4, which is referred to here for a number of years already. And so we're just continuing in that vein.
Mrs. Fry, you want to come back on that?
Yes, please. I think the council's response is focused on answering the question of whether they can, but not on whether they should. And what we've essentially heard is that the London plan sets a series of higher targets, and that's part of the statutory development plan. And we've heard that it's also going through a process of reviewing the standards in light of the new building regulations. And what we've got as a starting point is para 16 of the framework, point F, that says that plans should serve a clear purpose, avoiding unnecessary duplication of policies that apply to a particular area. And among the things that the council has said in defence of its approach is that we shouldn't worry because the standard will be, I can't remember the precise word, but it's a broadly equivalent to what the London plan is and the review of the policy is aiming towards. Well, if it's doing that, then that's a duplication of what's being done at the London level. And there's been talk about the benefits of a London-wide approach to improving climate change performance. Quite right. That's what the London plan does. There's no need for the local plan to add unnecessary duplication, add standards or requirements that are subtly different and make it more difficult to understand what the policy requirements are, because at the moment we're faced with an applicant who's going to have to look at the London plan, going to have to look at the supplementary planning document and the review of policy that emerges from it, and look at the local plan. They're all saying slightly different things, and of course then the building regulations as well, and somehow chart a way through this. that's not, in my view, what the MPPF is clear that plans should do, which is to provide, insofar as it ever is possible with the planning system, some degree of clarity as to what the policy is and what standards a development proposal should comply with. And in that context, I don't see what purpose these policies in the Merton local plan perform, given what we already have through the higher tiers of policy. Thank you.
Okay, the final point on this, Ms. Butler, before we take a short break.
I'll be brief. Just to say that, to reiterate rather, that Merton has a climate strategy and action plan adopted in 2020 that sets a 2050 target for net zero. Since the London plan was submitted in 2018, the government has something similar. And while I have some sympathy with Mr. Spry and trying to navigate London's planning system, it is true of every single policy in a local plan. There wouldn't be a lower tier local plan if we took Mr. Spry's point of view. Our policies are flexible. They simply set carbon reduction targets, and they don't talk about what technology should be used or how this should be done. And they are tested thoroughly for viability. I would also finish by pointing out that while we are raising with yourselves and the room that the GLA are taking a different approach from us, it's simply a point of information. Its building regs will change tomorrow. We will get more information from government apparently in late July as to the supporting evidence for those changes in building regs. We will use that to create an equivalent target, but it's simply for information that GLA intend to raise theirs. So whether that happens or whether that doesn't, we believe our plan is positively prepared, effective and sound.
Thank you, Ms. Butler. I think given where we are with the GLA and what we've just discussed, I think it'd be sensible to park it until the stage 2 sessions when there's more clarity on that. It may well be that GLA have embark on something that will take a longer time to deal with, but we'll know by that point what their intentions are. So I think we've gone possibly as far as we can on that particular building regs point this afternoon. So with that in mind, if we take a short adjournment, it's nearly 4 o'clock. If we come back at 10 past. Oh, okay, this hearing is adjourned. Okay, if we can resume. So in the MIQs document, we posed the question about the outcomes that the policies seek to achieve and whether they offer sufficient flexibility in terms of the solutions that could be deployed. So we've heard the council's general views on this in the answer to our opening questions on it. But I'd like to invite Mr. Spry again to outline St William's position on this and how, in your view, the plan as currently drafted might inhibit flexibility in these terms and act to the detriment of meeting carbon targets.
Thank you. I think our response on this point was that the policies are focused on outcomes, but there is actually, I think, contrary to what's being suggested, there is actually very little flexibility within the policies as to how those are to be achieved. And by way of example, there are, for example, specific provisions around not having gas boilers, which I know is subject to a separate question, but also requirements in the policy, for example, CC 2.1, to maximize energy efficiency, low carbon heat and local renewable energy generation. Now, taken at face value, when it's a requirement for all development, as expressed in CC 2.1, to minimize greenhouse gas emissions and maximize those things, that isn't in of itself providing flexibility, because there are different ways of achieving the climate change outcomes, whereas the individual policies then put in place a series of very specific requirements in terms of how those are actually going to be achieved. So as an overall, it's not just a policy CC 2.1 point, it's across the suite of policies. And in line with what we've talked about the sort of trade-offs in terms of other policy objectives, it seems to us that it's imposing the council's template for how it thinks climate change outcomes should be achieved, rather than following the London plan approach of setting some minimum standards and then allowing developers to bring forward schemes that meet those minimum standards, and then bring forward different combinations of measures to achieve sustainable development outcomes. Thank you.
So, Mr. Spry, you touched on the gas boilers issue, and you've also outlined in your hearing statement some concerns about that. Do you want to outline them a bit further for the benefit of the hearing, please?
Yeah, so I think the first point was, and it goes to the question 25 around whether the installation of gas boilers comes within the scope of development and use of land, and therefore whether that approach is justified. It is of note that in the Part L building regulations, gas boilers are explicitly permitted, and it's not clear, if I can be slightly flippant, why gas boilers specifically are unacceptable in Merton but are acceptable in other London boroughs. And there isn't a explicit justification and evidence-based case for why gas boilers and their exclusion should or must be part of the suite of climate change policy responses in this borough, when that isn't a requirement more generally. As a generality, it's partly a, I think it's from 2023, the requirement in the policy. What is actually going to be the dominant technology for replacing gas boilers is yet to be established. So there's a lot of talk around sort of air and ground source heat pumps at the moment, we're looking to 2030. There's talk around hydrogen solutions, either one of which may prove to be more effective than the other. And there's a reason that the building regulations haven't excluded gas boilers at this moment in time. It's because which is going to be the dominant technology, to sort of take a Betamax versus VHS sort of analogy, you know, which is going to be the dominant technology for heating water and providing central heating in homes on a net zero basis is yet to be established, and it seems premature for Merton to be setting out a requirement around gas boilers now, when the answer to that question hasn't yet been established. And remembering that by 2030, it may well be that the gas boilers that are being installed can then be replaced by the new technology that has become dominant and more cost effective at that time. It's the point around future adaptability of that building stock. And I know, for example, St William are looking about future-proofing their developments so that you can install gas boilers now because that's the cost-effective technology that's accepted in the market, but then ensure that you can then install future technologies down the line, and you've got that adaptability in the built form. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Spry. Any other views on that particular point, Ms. Patel? Mr. Michael?
I suppose in another way one could say that it's in the heating of let's call it a dwelling, the production of CO2 in the heating of the dwelling is the principal issue, as I understand it. And because you have to burn gas, it creates the CO2. If you use other sources, electricity being one, despite its expense, at the point that you're doing the burning, so to speak, there is no CO2 production. So one could express the policy in another way, that the council is concerned about the production of CO2 in new developments.
Thank you. So if I can invite Ms. Hill in for a reaction to those points.
Yes, thank you, Inspector. So if I can maybe start with the point around gas boilers. I think this is something that's set out in our hearing statement to matter 3, but I'll pick up on a couple of points that we've made there. And I think this links in again to the outcomes and the aims of our policies, which is very much to deliver our national and local carbon reduction commitments of being net zero carbon by 2050. And in line with extensive evidence base ranging from our own climate strategy and action plan, so reference 2D1, but also the London Energy Transformation Initiative's Climate Emergency Design Guide, reference 2D9, the Committee on Climate Change's UK Housing Fit for the Future, reference 2D11, and this study that was commissioned by several London boroughs on the cost of carbon, reference 2D12. There's a lot of supporting evidence there showing that in order for a building to operate at net zero carbon, it mustn't burn fossil fuels, and it must have ultra high energy efficiency, and it must be 100% powered by renewable energy. So that's what we're looking to achieve with our various policies. And it's significantly more expensive, both financially and in terms of carbon emissions, to retrofit a low carbon heating system compared to installing it from the start in a new build development. So our view is that gas boilers should very much be the exception and not the rule. And paragraph 2.4.7 of the local plan states that any development that proposes to use gas-powered systems will need to provide robust justification to satisfy Merton Council that low or zero carbon systems cannot be used, to set out how the development has been future-proofed to achieve net zero carbon by 2050, and to demonstrate that the gas-powered system is credibly being used as a stepping stone towards this objective. So I think that allows for exceptional cases where low carbon solutions might not be appropriate, but our view is that low carbon solutions should be the expected approach with our policies, and that's what we're trying to push development towards. In terms of hydrogen, and a point which was raised, I think, by Mr. Spry, paragraph 2.4.3 of the local plan sets out our current understanding on the likelihood of hydrogen being used to replace the current gas grid to make that a more low carbon solution, and that seems very unlikely at this stage. So based on the current information that we have, other low carbon solutions, which will likely include primarily heat pumps, are the direction of travel that we want to be moving in. I think that's probably my initial response on that. I don't know if Ms. Butler has anything to add.
Is this a point to that, or is Mr. Spry, did you want to make a specific point to?
The council want a tag team, and then I'll come back.
It was. I think they went up at the same time. Ms. Butler, if you go first.
My point was relevant to Mr. Spry's comment on the strategic climate change policy. Is that where you want to go, or would you rather deal with the gas boilers and then move on?
Mr. Spry, was your point in relation to the gas boilers?
I feel like a corgi engineer. Yes, it sort of was. I think it's a general point, and I was being slightly flippant about the sort of Betamax VHS point, but it's quite clear that by the policy's aiming for net zero by 2050. That's still 18 years away, and we're at a sort of technological sort of tipping point, or sort of intervening period as we move from one technology through to the next one. And the point that was made about hydrogen is quite pertinent, because the plan, when it refers to that, says it's unlikely to be feasible in the short term, and in a sense that's precisely my point. We're moving from gas boilers, undoubtedly. There's current focus around, for example, heat pumps, but there are some, they're expensive at the moment, and there's some doubts about whether they are the medium to long-term solution. But they may well be appropriate in some forms of development. But in other forms of development, it may well be around maintaining gas boilers and then moving to a different form of technology that provides a better long-term solution. And what we have at the moment is a plan approach that's very strident in its conclusion that gas boilers shouldn't be adopted, when the building regs that have very carefully considered this issue at a national level, and frankly the technology and kit for installing this technology as a national issue, has explicitly decided not to ban gas boilers. And some of this, for example, is that the industry currently doesn't have enough people who are trained to fit heat pumps. So the technology might exist, the kit, has a certain cost, but the industry needs thousands of people to be trained to actually install them. And if those people don't exist at the moment, but hopefully will do, as we move to later in the decade, then that technology can be wrapped up within the building regulations, and the industry will respond to it. But if we're applying in Merton specifically something that says that the industry has to adopt a different kind of approach, absent evidence to show that some of those more strategic barriers to adoption of those new technologies has been properly addressed, then that, to my mind, is not an effective approach in a local plan. If the London plan had adopted that approach, then perhaps, still seems unlikely to me, but perhaps the industry could take a London-wide view of this. But to sort of set an approach where only in exceptional circumstances can you not install a gas boiler doesn't seem to be a justified policy approach to me in terms of this local plan. Thank you.
Okay, Ms. Butler, coming back on that point specifically. So we've heard from Ms. Hill that there's some circumstances where gas technologies might be allowable, but it be in exceptional circumstances. So, which is in supporting text. So with that in mind, is the sort of there shall be no gas boilers restriction in the policy justified, or would some more positive wording be more appropriate?
My understanding is you're inviting us to reflect on that and to consider whether more appropriate wording regarding more positive wording, sorry, would be more appropriate.
Yeah, I think we've heard Mr. Spry's views, haven't we, on the building regs generally. We've heard views on what technologies might be coming in, or in the longer term. There was that point that Mr. Spry made on that relates to deliverability as well, in terms of how many people there are that can install some of these more modern technologies. So just taking all of those things into account, and the sort of technical point on whether gas boilers in themselves are a B development, whether that wording's justified, and whether there's some alternative wording you could propose that still supports the view that you're moving the direction of travel you're moving in, but it will perhaps be a more effective policy response to it.
Okay, if there's nothing else left to say on that, we will move on. Question 6 about heritage assets. Now in our MIQs, we posed a question about whether the climate change policies of the plan pay appropriate attention to the conservation of the significance of heritage assets. Whilst we will move on to discuss design and heritage in more detail at stage 2, we know that a number of MMs have been suggested to address Historic England's concerns in these regards, both in terms of the policies and supporting text in the climate change chapter and to policy D12.5. Ms. Woolley, if you could please outline these for the purpose of the hearing and how they intended to address any perceived soundness issues in these regards. And just in doing so, just some kind of initial kind of thoughts on the MM might need some tidying up, in particularly some grammar in the supporting text, for example, 12.5.3. And there's a kind of question for us at the moment about not being 100% sure about being or within historic buildings in the proposed new paragraph after 2.3.23. For example, would it be better to say would have an effect on on historic buildings, and the policy might also need just some tweaking after discussions, but just kind of your views on that, please.
Thank you, Inspector. For the benefit of the inquiry, this information I'm about to read from is available on Merton Council's website about the examination library under the heading Statement of Common Ground, and it's catchily titled Statement of Common Ground, Historic England and Merton Council on Matter 3, Climate Change, dated 25th of May, 2022. As Mr. Aston said, it is clear from Historic England's representations to Regulation 19 that they raised some issues regarding policy 12.5 and climate change matters, and we have continued dialogue with Historic England, and we have reached a statement of common ground that we believe addresses finally any particular matters. There are a few main modifications proposed as a result of that. One is part of the justification of policy CC 2.3, where it recognizes that proposals for historic buildings are encouraged to use a whole building approach. This is a way of approaching retrofits that's looking at all aspects of the building, really, as do many other approaches to retrofit, to make sure that there is no unintended consequences from improving the fabric of a historic building, such as, for example, putting in too much insulation and resulting in damp. Historic England, at the back of their response, have listed a number of guidance documents that can help people looking at historic assets in that regard. There is an additional modification adding the word secondary glazing as one of the measures to consider on paragraph 2.6.5. There's a main modification proposed to policy D12.5. So this is the managing heritage assets policy, and this really ties it together with the climate change policies we're looking at in matter 3, and it adds statements relating to the historic environment to part G of that policy. Again, repeating the reuse, retrofit, whole building approach, and tying that together with heritage significance. And there's an associated proposed modification to paragraph 12.5.3 to pick up on that. Finally, there is at 12.5.3, sorry, and 12.5.15. 12.5.15 is recognizing that the energy and carbon performance of historic buildings can be improved, which will help them remain viable and useful now and in the future. And it points out the sensitivities to reducing carbon from the use of the building, but also making sure that the significance of the heritage asset isn't compromised as a result. And that modification adds in Historic England's guidance that can help applicants in that.
Thank you, Ms. Butler. Are there any views from around the table on what we've just heard? Mr. Michael.
Yes, it seemed to us in the society that many existing buildings of heritage, let's call them that, are going to have to be adapted in one form or another. Now, quite a number of those changes will need the approval of the council, listed building consent perhaps, planning permission and so forth when it affects the exterior. And so what we thought was that it would be helpful if we produced some kind of a matrix listing down one side of the sheet the sort of works that are possible, a whole range of stuff, and running across the other way, what sort of consents, permissions or whatever, should be applied to, here it comes, the listed buildings, conservation area and local list, other buildings, and so forth. And when we started writing that down, we realized that it really was very difficult for, if you like, the ordinary person. They'd have to go to their planning office and work out with the planning office. Did they need consent for this or whatever it was? And in some of the cases, you don't need consent at all. It's internal stuff, as long as it's not listed, of course. And so that's clear and out of the way. On the other hand, you asked the question, here is this superb roof of wonderful Cumberland slate or whatever in graded courses, fantastic roof in a, as it happens, only a locally listed building locally. And could you put solar panels on that? Oh dear, you'd be a bit edgy about that, wouldn't you? So in some cases, we found ourselves at a real difficulty saying, what was our view about the tension, if you like, between the environment in the aesthetic sense and the environment in the climate change sense. And it took us some time to get something down on paper. And even so, looking at it, some of us felt, oh, we're going a bit far towards letting things happen to historic buildings that we really shouldn't be doing. Not listed, heritage buildings in conservation areas and so forth. And others saying, well, come on, we want to do more in the way of allowing for these changes to do with climate change alleviation. And so we've tried to write it down. We've sent it to the council simply as an aid memoir to see if we can work it through. It's not of course, part of the plan, but I think it illustrated to us how difficult it was to know when you needed permission and why you needed permission and what were the balances between these two tensions. So if I can get that point across, I'm not sure that it helps us. We made a number of suggestions in our comments about how you can actually slightly extend things, but we would want to work with the council in the future to see whether or not some sort of SPG or whatever could be produced to explain how to do these works to buildings without severe implications. We came across one the other day, for example, which was external wall insulation on a terrace for one property. Gosh, you just imagine looking at that. At the moment, it's a brick terrace. It's not a heritage terrace particularly. It's quite nice in its way. And one of the properties is going to be that much further forward, and it's going to be all rendered because that's the way in which it's done. And the edge details, what are they? Well, we never could find out that. The reveal details around the windows, the arches that were there, all of these things are disappearing. And so that's a tension where on the one hand, you want to do the thing to improve the building's performance in terms of heat and so forth. On the other, you say to yourself, how far am I allowed to go in letting go of the character of this particular building? So I don't say there's not the answer, but I think it is the question which needs to be addressed. And the plan at the moment, I would suggest, could benefit from some other stuff going into it.
Thank you, Mr. Michael. Respond at all to any of those points, Ms. Fuller?
Just briefly to say that the main modification we propose in the statement of common ground with Historic England on main matter 3, that's the modification to paragraph 12.5.15, page 57 of the submitted local plan on the policy of managing heritage assets. It links to Historic England's guidance on the very same point about the sensitivities of retrofitting historic and indeed traditionally constructed buildings and making sure that their historic significance is included. And we thank the Wimbledon Society for sending through the note that they have.
Thank you.
Okay, moving on more specifically to the policies and some of the wording in the CC2 policies. So we've heard views earlier that firstly that the clarity of words such as maximize, minimize, ultra energy efficiency, in terms of how clear they be to decision makers. And Mr. Spide picked up on that point. So are any main modifications suggested to assist with the clarity of the plan in those regards?
After I finish speaking, I'm going to invite my colleague Dominic Hill to come in, but just to say that policy Mr. Spry was referring to is CC 2.1, the strategic policy on climate change. And really this summarizes as much as we can paragraphs already mentioned in the MPPF, which doesn't use the words maximizing energy efficiency, but it does say or minimizing greenhouse gas. It uses the phrase radical reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. The London Plan has similar policies on maximizing energy efficiency and minimizing greenhouse gas emissions. So really, this is our strategic policy, and the details of how to achieve that are set out in the subsequent policies, CC2 onwards. The strategic policy is simply summarising the MPPF and our evidence and all the evidence that points to the need to get to net zero by 2050.
Ms. Hill, did you want to come in on that?
Thank you, Inspector. I think in terms of any proposed modifications in the context of using terms like maximised, there is one proposed modification, MM2.4. This is in response to question 28C on the hearing statement. There has been a change proposed there in the context of whole life cycle carbon emissions, where it previously talked about demonstrating that whole life cycle carbon savings have been maximised. We're proposing a change here to align with the wording in the London Plan, to change it to and demonstrate actions taken to reduce life cycle carbon emissions. Apologies if you weren't going all the way to the life cycle carbon emissions in that question, but I just thought I would flag that one. Otherwise, nothing to add to what Ms. Butler said.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Hill. Mr. Spry?
Thank you. So I think the first point is one about duplication. So if CC 2.1 is setting the strategic objectives and is mirroring, if it was mirroring the London Plan approach, then there's no need for the policy, because it's duplicating. However, I think it's actually, it's a distinct policy approach, because if the policy that Ms. Butler was referring to around the London Plan was policy SI2, the title of that policy is minimising greenhouse gas emissions, but then the actual provisions that apply to developments then have more specific requirements that talk about reducing greenhouse emissions and then minimising both annual and peak energy demand, in accordance with a hierarchy that then has a series of specific provisions within it. And then there's other elements of the policy then again have those kind of specific requirements. So for example, under E, it says major development proposals should calculate and minimize carbon emissions from any other parts of the development, including that are not covered by big building regulations, i.e. unregulated emissions. So it's got an overall objective to minimize, but then has quite specific requirements either from the building regulations or the other specific policy provisions. That's different from what policy CC 2.1 does, because that says this will be achieved by requiring all development to minimize greenhouse gas emissions and maximize energy. So it's essentially, I read that as being, I bring forward a development, I'm being asked by this policy to minimize and maximize in my development, not to effectively meet a series of specific requirements. So I think that is the distinction to be made on that particular point. Thank you.
Okay, any reactions to that, Ms. Butler?
Yes, just to point out again that CC 2.1 is the strategic policy. In this example for CC 2.2, minimising greenhouse gas emissions, sets out both the targets and exactly what developments they apply to. So different targets apply to dwellings versus non carbon reduction targets set out across that policy, depending on whether it's one dwelling or the square meterage of non-residential. I point out again that in the strategic policies, as in the London plan and any strategic plan, it's the details that are filled in subsequent policies, not just the strategic ones which set the direction of travel.
And in terms of it being applicable to all development, and that's something that's said in quite a few of the climate change policies, as opposed to, say, all major development. Is that justified?
Yes, it's fully justified. It has also been tested for viability. At a London level, in the London plan, some of these policies apply to major development only, but as set out in our evidence base and discussed at length, over 90% of Merton's applications, for example, for new homes, are of sites of less than 10 units. And that is a defining characteristic of Merton, and has been a characteristic for over 12 years, and in the future is likely to continue, that we are a small site borough. So as with policy CC 2.2, it specifies it applies to development resulting in the creation of one or more dwelling. And then on section C, it specifies different carbon reduction targets. There's a little table there that looks at major residential, minor residential, change of use, etc. And finally, under D and E or D, it carries on with one or more dwelling or 500 meters squared of commercial floor space. So it clearly sets out what these targets apply for. There's no ambiguity there.
Mr. Michael, did you want to come back in?
This is question 7, I think, isn't it? In the question 7, the last of the 4 lines, does the policy, in effect, does it encourage the reuse and the retrofit and the adaptation of existing buildings? I've made the point already, I'm afraid. It's all very well having policies, but I don't believe the plan is going to deliver anything unless we have a program of work, a set of targets, and an understanding of resources through time. Otherwise, it'll just be words, and we will not achieve climate change objectives. And to that extent, it's so important. I feel that this is a fundamental in the plan.
Thank you, Mr. Michael. I think we've already heard your views on it, Ms. Butler. Ms. Hill, is it? You wanted to come in?
Yes, thank you, Inspector. It was just to add to Ms. Butler's point, the wording that she referred to with regards to policy CC 2.2. I just wanted to flag that is a proposed modification, so modification 2.1a, which is covered in question 12 of the hearing statement, and that wording is clarified there in terms of making it as clear as possible which types of developments each of those requirements apply to. Thank you.
Okay, so if we can move on to the energy use intensity. So is it clear how anticipated energy use intensity at design and preoccupation stage will be addressed? And what main modifications have been proposed to secure clarity in these terms?
Yes, it is clear where we incorporate main modification 2.2 to that effect. It adds extra clarity on these issues.
So what would be the trigger for disclosure of the EUI at pre-occupation stage? And what would the consequences be for development if this showed that maximum energy targets will be missed at that stage?
I'm going to pass over to Ms. Hill, if that's all right.
Yes,
Ms.
of course.
Hill?
Thank you. So just to clarify on the energy use intensity targets, which are covered in policy CC 2.3, the initial requirements are going to be just to require development to report on their energy use intensity. So under policy CC 2.3, all development resulting in the creation of one or more dwellings or 500 meters squared or more non-residential GIA are required to disclose the anticipated energy use intensity at design and pre-occupation stage. The energy use intensity targets included in policy CC 2.3E are only proposed to be adopted from January 2025. Those are included at this stage, and developers will be kind of expected to work towards those, but they won't be enforced. Yes, hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, so just in terms of that preoccupation stage, so if at that stage the development showed that maximum energy targets will be missed, so what will be the implications for the development?
Sorry, can you repeat exactly what you said just then? At the preoccupation stage, something would be missed?
Yeah, so it talks about, the policy talks about disclosure of EUI at preoccupation stage.
Yeah.
So there's effectively two stages, aren't there, where the energy use intensity will be assessed. So at the design and the preoccupation stage. So it might pass at design, but then at preoccupation stage, if it doesn't pass that test, what can you do then? I mean, what's the implications for the development then?
So this is something that would need to be captured through preoccupation conditions, and this links into the GLA's be seen reporting requirements. So they already have frameworks in place to report on some of this information. I think this is, in terms of the actual implementation of the policies after January 2025, I think this is potentially something that we will need to consider. We're still in quite early stages of using energy use intensity targets, and that's where we're trying to use this slightly phased approach, where we're trying to gather some more information about what types of energy use intensity targets are being achieved. The GLA is also looking to move in that direction as well in their new guidance. So I think the enforcement of those targets will become clearer in the run-up to the implementation of those targets from January 2025. I don't know if Ms. Butler has anything to add on that.
Not this time, no.
I think possibly that's something that might benefit from a bit more scrutiny from your point of view, Ms. Butler, in terms of whether it's an effective and effective policy in those terms, because it looks, from my reading of it, and I'll be blunt here, but I don't mean to sound sort of pejorative. It's like we'll collect some information and then we'll collect some more information, but it's kind of so what. So I'd like to know, why it's happening and what the implications of it are. So if you could reflect on a main modification on that, please. Okay, are there any other views on the EUI before we move on? Okay, so you've suggested a change to address our query relating to the residential amenity implications of heat pumps. So that's set out at paragraph 3.60 of your hearing statement, Ms. Butler. Given that this would have a material effect on the interpretation of the policy, I think this one should be categorized as a main modification rather than as an additional modification. Obviously, we did say we'd pick these up where we considered that to be the case, but if that could also be identified in that respect.
Inspector, just to clarify, it's currently proposed AM 2.9A, and that's to be a main modification.
Okay, so these are the last topic that we've got any further questions on. So in terms of policy CC 2.5, so there's you've said in the hearing statement that the policy is only relevant for developments involving existing buildings. So is that clear from the policy itself, which actually refers to all development proposals? So that if you can reflect on that point, and then also could you talk us through the proposed modification on this policy and how it would address any perceived soundness concerns, please?
Thank you, and we will reflect on policy CC 2.5. The proposed modification is 2.3, which looks at promoting a circular economy approach to building design. And it also clarifies that circular economy, as far as possible, should be, the modification is made to improve the effectiveness of the policy and really tightening it up so that people understand what it applies to and how the circular economy approach should be interpreted. It proposes modifications to section B and corresponding modifications to the first paragraph of the policy, and also section C to refer to the need to minimize embodied carbon and limit the need for repair and replacement of existing buildings or of new buildings.
Thank you, Ms. Butler. Are there any other points on this policy? So that's policy CC 2.5 specifically. Mr. Michael.
When it comes to reuse of buildings, we've got statements from the Royal Institute of British Architects, which is along the lines of these existing buildings should be retrofitted as much as possible. Yeah, I mean, I encapsulate there, they put it far better than that, but essentially they're moving away from everything new is great to we have to reflect climate change situations by adapting existing buildings far more. And secondly, there is an environmental audit committee, that is a common select committee, of course, in 26th May of this year, produced a report which says the government should prioritize the reuse and retrofit of buildings over building new ones as part of the work required to reduce the levels of CO2. No whole mass of stuff there. And so that is, to me, an indication of the way in which major bodies, government in this case, the RIBA in another case, are really changing their views to understand and trying to get to grips with this business of when you pull a building down, it has an embodied carbon amount. That should be taken into account in assessing the planning application, so that one can imagine a situation where it isn't only the energy use of the new building that is being discussed. That's certainly been done recently, of course, but also to see what the carbon implications are, if you like, of the whole, first of all, the whole life of the building, including its eventual demise and its running, but also the before the building is built, which is to do with the demolition, perhaps, of an existing building on the site. So the whole carbon approach seems to be on the cards, both in national discussions and in discussions in learned bodies, so that the planning application isn't just seen now, as it used to be, of course, as a set of drawings of a building with uses and activities and walls and positions and elevations and so forth. It's got a whole raft of assessments. Some of us will say that there are too many assessments for ordinary people like the Wimbledon Society to try to understand, but that's another matter. So I feel that there is a groundswell of opinion now, which really has to indicate that carbon has to be understood in all respects when it comes to a building's either adaptation or demolition and replacement. Whether or not the plan fully takes that point on board, well, it may be that the plan has been slightly overtaken by these more recent statements, but I think essentially it's saying essentially to me the right things. It may be that some more refinements need to be put in.
Thank you, Mr. Michael. So we've got no further questions on this matter at this juncture. We've said there's some things that we'll come back to in stage 2 once we've got a clearer view on the GLA's position on some of these things. Is there, before we wrap up on this matter, is there anything that any others would like to cover? Ms. Patel?
Thank you. Just a couple of points. In the local plan, where I think it's policy CC 2.2, where it refers to carbon offsetting and the potential for carbon offsetting measures off-site, where there's agreement with the local plan. I think we've set out in our statement that Clarion support that initiative, noting they own and manage a large amount of housing stock in the borough. One of the things I noted in the supporting text is, I think paragraph 2.25 refers to the shortfall being offset via renewable energy generation, and I think that's repeated again in later paragraphs. I think one of the points I just wanted to check was, at the moment, that there's a focus on renewable technologies and renewable energy, whereas there's also opportunities for improving energy efficiency, insulation of existing housing stock. And I wonder whether there's sort of a modification there around sort of allowing for improvements to energy efficiency, retrofitting, things like that through the carbon offset fund. That's one point. And then the second point I was going to raise is Ms. Butler previously raised the strategic projects that Clarion are bringing forward are coming forward under the estate's local plan. That was prepared and adopted in 2018. in the context of the adopted local plan and London plan, so documents dating back 2012, 2014 and 2016. So there is a policy relating to each estate, relating to environmental protection, and that currently relates to, for 2 of the sites, talks about combined heat and power as an energy solution. And since that time, from a sort of a direction of travel perspective, both Clarion and from a policy perspective, there has been a move away from combined heat and power. So I think there's just something to be looked at there in terms of whether there are parts of that policy which would be out of date and would be superseded, whereby if Clarion were coming forward with new proposals for an estate, it's the new local plan policies which will apply. And that's sort of stems some of our concern in terms of some of the policies, in terms of making sure that they are as flexible as possible.
Thank you, Ms. Patel. So in terms of that point on whether the supporting text is drafted appropriately in terms of the kind of things that might be appropriate for carbon offsetting, have you got a view on that, Ms. Butler?
Just to repeat, this is paragraph 2.2.5. I'm going to pass over to Ms. Hill before I agree to that.
Ms. Hill?
I think this is potentially something that we'll need to take away and consider. Something that we always need to consider in terms of carbon offsetting is making sure that there's additionality in the measures, so that it's adding value beyond business as usual. So if retrofitting of existing properties is something that Clarion needs to be doing anyway, it's whether we can justify using the carbon shortfall, carbon offset equivalent to fund those measures is appropriate or not. So maybe that's something we can take away and look at in the context of the GLA's guidance on carbon offset funds.
Thank you. And is that something you could work on with Clarion Housing, perhaps in going to a statement of common ground on that position? Might that be a useful thing to do? Yeah, so would you be able to work? Does that sound a reasonable thing to do, Ms. Patel?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. What was the other point, Ms. Patel? In
The estate's local plan contains a policy on environmental protection for each of the estates, and I think for 2 of them refers to looking at the feasibility of CHP technologies, and the point about sort of the policies having moved on, and if as and when new proposals came forward on any of these estates over the plan period, I think it'd be the new policies which would be given the most weight, and that's some of our concerns about making sure they're flexible enough.
Yeah, well, I think that section 38(5) of the 2004 Act says subsequently adopted policies within the same development plan would carry more weight. I'm paraphrasing here, that's not what it actually says, but it takes precedence, my colleague says. So there's the statutory provision for that. So that wouldn't necessarily need any amendments to the plan to reflect that. Mr. Spry?
Thank you. It's a linked point on the offset fund, and it was identified in the question around there's a different offset price from that in the London plan, and the reference point for the figure is a generic one from the we've included the reference in the our matters statement, the Etude et al. Report. I think the concern here links to the point around the flexibility and the trade-off with other policy requirements, that the plan has set a higher offset price than the London plan, but it's not clear what the council proposes to do with that resource in terms of specific measures that it will use to reduce carbon emissions. And it would be, I think, a difficult position for the plan if, for example, it required developments to pay a higher offset price, and in doing so reduced affordable housing provision without knowing what that offset price was actually going to achieve by way of carbon reductions. Because the plan, if it had that outcome, hasn't been tested or justified on that basis in terms of the sustainability appraisal. And it goes to the point I started with today, which is we just need that clearer framework for what's the hierarchy of policy choices that applicants are expected to go with in order to arrive at a viable scheme in circumstances where there are, for example, extra regeneration costs. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, and as I've said, I've heard the general point, Mr. Spry, earlier, on that particular point now, and we've heard the council's views on it up to this point, but that's something that Inspector Aston and myself will take away and reflect on in drafting our post hearings letter on this particular phase of hearings. Mr. Michael, you've still got your
Yes, presumably these are the sort of final statements. Sorry about a bit of repetition. It's going to have to happen, isn't it? I think for me, the plan, it makes very good attempts. And I think one has to say to I would say to the council, well done for producing a plan in what must have been terrible conditions, COVID and all the rest of it. How you did it, I have no idea, but well done, despite our views on certain parts of it. It attempts, but how does it actually deliver on climate change? We don't feel that the plan does. And what we'd like to see is specific proposals. Retrofitting and adaptation of the existing building stock, in our view, needs to be a part of the plan. Grant aiding needs to be a part of the plan. A new version of the Merton Rule energy standard. New development to be zero carbon in order to get approval. Amelioration offset values to reflect real life costs. They've gone up from, I think it was 90 up to 300 now. The real figures that we're hearing from services specialists are around 600, but there we go. Embedded carbon values to include demolitions, and then a couple of which we haven't actually discussed today. PV panels, when you install them, they don't work if they're shaded, and so should we not have a policy which prevents the shading of existing roofs, which may or may not have PV panels on them? Otherwise, you're just installing the panels, but they don't actually do any generation. And lastly, we haven't heard much about this one, although it was one of the first questions. Shouldn't we be prioritizing pedestrians over vehicles as part of our climate change stuff? When we look at what we've got, I'm sorry to say, I think our view is that the plan fails to deal adequately with climate change, and therefore there must be a risk of it being considered unsound.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Michael. I mean, you touched on some points that we'll come back to in the rest of the hearings, particularly in terms of sort of transport and pedestrian routes and those types of things. But just as a final response to those points, Ms. Butler.
Thank you, and thank you to the Wimbledon Society for their positive support on that. I just pick up a couple of points that we maybe haven't covered in the hearings before. One is that, yes, the £300 a tonne is an attempt to more accurately reflect the actual cost of carbon rather than previous £60 or £90 a tonne. And we are aware of other research that says it should be higher. On the point about prioritising pedestrians, that is emphasised very much in the council's policies, in the London Plan policies about healthy streets approach and prioritising pedestrians over cyclists, pedestrians and cyclists over private cars. And I think that's all.
Okay, so thank you all for your contributions this afternoon. That concludes our discussion on matter 3. We're going to now just have a brief catch up with the council. It's our housekeeping session just to pick up any additional items or modifications that we've suggested during the day, just to make sure those are accurately recorded. People are quite free to stay around for that, but you don't have to. There's no compulsion to do so if you'd like to leave now. So again, thank you for your contributions. Okay, so I'll just to start the housekeeping session, I'll pick up on the things that I've noted down, and Inspector Aston's made a note as well. So hopefully our notes and your notes will accord with each other. So we discussed this morning when we were talking about the statement of community involvement and related matters, and the extension to the regulation 18 period. So we talked about, there's an action point there on what communications were put out to that effect, and whether they could be just produced in a note as an examination document. So that was the first point I picked up. We discussed how allocation WI3 might pick up the habitats regulation assessment stuff. That is really just a flag at this point, so that we know that we're going to come back. But you might want to think about it before we come to the session. Just maybe have something that we could discuss. But that's up to you on that point. Talked about the plan period in matter 2, and those related issues relating to housing supply and the housing delivery test. So I suggested that a topic paper might be useful on that, just to crystallize what your thinking is, and to inform the sort of more concrete version of a main modification in those terms. Ms. Butler.
Can I just confirm that relates to the plan, the 15-year plan period? So it's that connection with the housing supply.
So in short, we posed that question earlier today about when the plan period should start. So there's the modification that suggests it should start 2022-23, but whether actually it be more effective in terms of plan's approach to housing requirements and supply, whether it starts, although it'll be in the past, where it actually was when you submitted it at Regulation 19. So just a consideration of that, I think, taken together with DLUC's letter on the housing delivery test, which refers to the housing delivery test rule book and talks about plan periods that can start ahead of adoption. So yeah, that again, that we wouldn't anticipate that topic paper being prepared in any short order, but as long as it's ready and for when we come back at stage 2, so we can discuss that in more detail then. So we discussed as well in matter 2 some of the formatting changes that are proposed in terms of the plan, and whilst you know there are other things that have to be done in terms of modifications before we come to a kind of a finalized version of a plan with modifications that you can consult on. Just an idea by stage 2 of what sort of formatting changes you'll be proposing to ensure the clarity of the plan and the effectiveness. So the things like the distinction between policies and supporting text. So again, that is something that, again, we don't require it in short order, but would certainly be useful before we come back to the next stage of hearing. Again, in the matter 2 discussion, we talked about the monitoring. We said that there was an action point for Inspector Aston and myself to go away and look at the monitoring indicators in the round in terms of what we talked about with the representative from Mitcham Cricket Green Heritage and Community. But there was an action point for you in terms of the main modification, looking at the actions and the triggers for those actions that would be included on the table. There's also a related action there in terms of how monitoring could reflect that objective in terms of the west and east of the borough, and how the plan would be effective in those terms.
Yeah, and this afternoon, we talked about the policy and the incorporation of viability testing, and this issue about the primacy and the hierarchy. I think you're going to have a look at that, whether viability could be brought into the policy.
Yeah, I think in those terms where we'd left it was that you were going to have a look whether the viability aspects of the plan could be clearer in terms I accept where they are at the moment in the supporting text, but just to reflect on the clarity of that. And we were going to go away and reflect on the primacy thing, just taking into account all the discussions and cover that in the hearings letter, post hearings letter. There was the gas boilers discussion and whether a main modification could be suggested in that respect. Talked about the EUI aspects and the main modification on that particular point, just to reflect on the effectiveness and the clarity of that policy. Talked about additional modification 2.9.a to become a main modification. The last one I got was in respect of Ms. Patel's point on paragraph 2.2.5, and that was on carbon offsetting and what the sort of solutions could be to that. So, and the suggestion that maybe a statement of common ground could be drafted on that basis. It doesn't have to be very extensive, just have to cover that point. So that was in terms of main modifications and other pieces of work. That's all I've got. I hope that accords with everybody else's note there.
I've got a few. They may not be minor. It was just mentioned that I picked up. The infrastructure delivery plan will be refreshed before stage 2 hearings. The council will consider including a reference to biodiversity net gains in the biodiversity monitoring in the indicator table as part of the monitoring table. I might have this wrong. The council will consider a main modification to the climate change policies following the new buildings regulations details release. There was a reference to potential main mods.
Yeah, I think where we left that was because I don't think it'd be productive to do another main modification at this stage, because we've got this London plan situation that's in a bit of flux, isn't it? So I think we just flag it that that's something to watch, but we'll once the position on the London plan becomes clearer, and hopefully that'll be by stage 2, we'll have something by then. Does that sound reasonable?
And then there was a reference to we'll reflect on main modification 2.3 with regards to policy CC 2.5.
Is this the point Ms. Patel made about improvements via carbon offsetting and retrofitting? Or is that?
No, I've got it. It's the point on it's a point on the position in your hearing statement is that it only refers to developments that involve existing buildings, whereas the policy actually says all development proposals. So it's just whether just reflecting on the clarity on that and whether any main modification could assist in that regard. But well spotted. I'd written it down and I'd missed it there. So is there anything else, Mr. van der Westhuyzen?
This is a rather embarrassing one because I got question mark, but maybe it trigger everybody around here. Council to review the wording of a main modification proposed in response to question 6. This is in the climate change. But when I looked at question 6, there is no main modification. So I don't know if it is the accurate note. Yeah, my colleague also got that, but if there's no, I'm not sure if it was question 6 in climate change, but if you don't have it, then So it was, we have to review the,
This was to do with the comments in relation to D12.5, question 6, heritage assets, and the modification might need some tidying up from a grammatical point of view in the supporting text, and that's the supporting text to and it's paragraph 12.5.3. And then I also mentioned about whether you might want to consider, you know, is the phrase "are within historic buildings" in the new paragraph after 2.3.23, and I just suggested whether you might want to have a look. Would it be better to have another phrase "would have an effect on" whatever it is? I think at the same time, the final point on that was to just have a look at that policy to see whether there's any tweaking following our discussions.
Okay, so that's everything we've got. Okay, so thank you. It's a bit later than we anticipated, but thank you all for your contributions today, and we'll be resuming the hearing sessions in the morning at 10. So good evening, everybody.